What's up, I'm playing Noriko. Today we're gonna watch the entire history of Monster Hunter final bosses. I still only have played through Wilds and stories. Yeah, I am not familiar with most of the bosses. I know them, I've seen them, but I'm not too familiar with them, so it's gonna be nice to learn about them. And if you have more videos you want me to react to, say so in the comments. I read every single comment. And let's dive in. We finally gonna watch this video. Hi Felix. Final bosses hunties. Yes. I'm pretty sure I know all of the final boss monsters, but getting more detail on them is gonna help. So yeah, let's watch it.
Hey, Fabius, do you think you'll be around forever?
No, probably not. I mean, we all die.
Well, at that point, I guess I'll just have to retire.
What?
Oh, nothing. I just sort of want you to be my final boss.
Ladies, gentlemen, and monsters of all
Bear.
ages,
One of the things that Monster Hunter games are known for is their endless replayability, and sometimes the thing that can get a bit lost because of that are the final bosses of each game, because you beat them and then you basically begin your long journey of power gain and build creation and crown collecting or whatever it is that you enjoy doing beyond the initial progression of the game. That said, Monster Hunter has a long and very interesting history of final bosses, and to be clear, when talking about the idea of a final boss, this is the only time I will ever call the monsters bosses instead of calling them monsters, because I think it's an important term within gaming. In most games with boss-type fights, the final boss is always clearly defined as the final major fight before the credits roll, usually having major story importance and often being given extra complex movesets or over-the-top visuals or extra phases to draw it out and just make it feel more impactful. Monster Hunter follows some of those rules, but the way that progression is defined in a lot of the games has so many different stages to it that we end up with at least 2 monsters considered as our final boss in each game. In early games of the series, this was mostly due to the village and online quest split. Village was the single player side of the game, and online was the multiplayer side of the game, of course. And while you could absolutely do online quests solo, there was no scaling, so they had the same health against one hunter that they did against 4. As a result, Village usually had the story, the first encounters of monsters and stuff like that, and then online was generally treated more like the end game, with high rank not being in Village in base games, and then G rank not being in Village in the expansions. In these times, the split was simply the final unlocked Village quest monster is the final boss of Village quests, and the final unlocked online quest monster is the final boss of online quests. And those are the technically correct answers, but there's another layer to it as well, which is that some monsters are very clearly designed by the developers to be a final boss, to feel final, and some of them are more just similar treatment like any standard monster, but they just happen to end up as a final boss because of the technicalities of quest progression order. That said, a perfect example of this is, of course, Monster Hunter 1, where we'll be starting today. The final boss of Village was Monoblos. Is Monoblos overly complex, intense story relevance, presented as a big spectacle or a massive threat?
It's funny that Monoblos is the first final boss.
But only by technicality. The online final boss of the first game, however, is Fatalis, whose quest requires you to beat every other online quest in the game, and then also kill like 100 large monsters to actually unlock it. Fatalis was built up through lore droplets to be a monster of incredible power. Visually, it looks totally unique to any other monster in the game, and while its actual moveset is relatively simple, it hit very hard, and its quest had a repel function where realistically you'd have to do like 4 Fatalis hunts successfully in a row to result in 1 proper single kill. And Fatalis wasn't the only Elder Dragon that had a repel and multiple quests to actually finish sort of function to it, but Fatalis required the most quests to actually fully kill, and that makes it feel like a very worthy final boss. It is designed with the concept of a final boss in mind. That said, today the bulk of what I want to talk about is the evolution of final bosses in the Monster Hunter series. I'll call out every one that we have had over the years and explain why they are considered a final boss, and for some of them, again, they're basically just normal monsters, so I'll blast past those pretty quick, but the ones that feel intentionally designed as final bosses, I want to follow the thread through and show you one by one how we got from Fatalis, which I just talked about in the first Monster Hunter game, to something like 𝘰𝘓𝘴𝘰, specifically Wild's 𝘰𝘓𝘴𝘰, who is the equivalent today of an online final boss, being the final monster added in the title updates. That said, before we move on properly, the thing that I really want you to focus on and keep in your mind with Fatalis is how they made it feel like a final boss. They made him imposing and threatening through his design and his visuals. They made his quest require more investment than most of them and used the quest structure itself to make him feel more impactful, as well as intentionally making him not just fit in with the rest of the monsters, making him feel sort of unnatural in comparison to the other creatures. In the expansion, Monster Hunter G, Lao Shenlong took over as the village quest final boss monster, and he was quite an interesting case. By modern standards, he's quite tame, but you have to remember that he was the very first oversized monster ever made, the first proper siege fight. He was imposing and impactful due to his sheer size and bulk more than anything else, and that does give him a bit of final boss energy, but it's worth noting that he was also in the base game of Monster Hunter. He wasn't new in the expansion, and so it takes a bit of the impact out of thinking of him as the final boss, in my opinion. The online final bosses was Fatalis once again. Only real change was it was G rank Fatalis now instead of high rank Fatalis. Then we had second generation games, starting with Monster Hunter DOS. The village final boss was Lunastra. Modern Lunastra's moveset, I think, would have absolutely been an incredible final boss if it existed for the first version of the monster at the time that was created, but at that time, back in Monster Hunter DOS, she really was essentially just like a blue Teostra, and I feel like Lunastra just didn't really have a final boss kind of vibe to her as a result of just not being the first of that creature, not being properly unique in that way. The online final boss of the game was Crimson Fatalis, a variation of Fatalis itself, this one able to cause literal meteors to fall down from the sky, really adding to the feel of it as a full-on walking calamity of a monster, and so it was essentially having the same superimposing lore and aura of Fatalis, but then increased even further because of the fight, and the same sort of quest structure to it too. And what's extra interesting is that DOS did actually have White Fatalis, who is considered the strongest Fatalis out of the three, but quest progression dictates that the final boss was actually Crimson Fatalis, not White Fatalis, which is extra interesting about that in my opinion.
You had Crimson after White Fatalis? That is stupid.
And the final bosses were different this time around. For Village
That's
Quest,
kind of
the final
stupid.
boss was Tigrex, who, while a very cool monster, also literally being a flagship, so he's designed to be quite memorable, but he also doesn't really have final boss vibes. He's just designed like any other monster. A really good monster, but clearly not designed to be a final boss really, and just is one by technicality. Following that is the online final boss, a Cantor. And I'd say this is the first final boss that isn't an Elder Dragon, but still had proper final boss energy, proper spectacle to it. Even his intro cutscene in this game was imposing as hell. You just watch this gigantic spiky lizard climb out of literal lava and then roar loud enough to shake the volcano at its feet, represented in the fight as well, too, by his roars being straight up attacks. What really cements him as being a properly intended final boss to me is that he was the first oversized monster not treated as a siege fight, meaning that you weren't intended to use ballistas and cannons and the demolisher. It was just a straight up hunter versus monster fight, just with the monster being absolutely massive. And this is, I think, was the start of a strong trend, which is aiming for a specific kind of spectacle for the final boss monsters, making them feel especially over the top in game, not just in lore and in vibe. In Freedom Unite, the second generation expansion, the village quest final boss was a Cantor once again, but online final boss was his comrade in arms, his polar opposite, 𝘂𝘴𝘦. 𝘂𝘴𝘦 was basically created to be a direct reflection of a Cantor, completely in reverse. He lives in the tundra, he uses ice instead of fire, and he also goes for the concept of a massive oversized monster that isn't a siege fight. No ballistas or cannons or anything like that, just you versus the monster, and I love using
aren't these
as like
two
a way to
categorized as flying
boss. I think
wyverns?
it was a great continuation of the same energy. Then we get to Monster Hunter Tri, which I think nailed it with both of its final bosses. The village final boss was Sadeas, the gigantic whale elder dragon monster. This perfectly fits the concept of a final boss not only being incredibly story relevant to the game, being a gigantic oversized monster with an otherworldly feel to it as well, and the fact that it is the devs really leaning into the main gimmick of Monster Hunter Tri being an underwater fight in a special arena and very unique as an experience as well. While I was never a massive fan of the fight itself, the design, the atmosphere, and the spectacle of it is an unforgettable experience and a clear upgrade from final bosses in previous generations. I don't think there could be a single better choice to be the village final boss for this game, and it shows a clear sort of increase in relevance for the concept of a village final boss. Then for online quest, the final boss was the first iteration of Alatreon, who is presented as an urgent quest when you hit HR 50, for a sort of scale of the difference of what was expected
But I
at
watched
this
it
point in
on the
time
history
compared to that had the unlock requirements for
on the
Fatalis
final
in the first
bosses.
game. That said, Alatreon was also a fantastic final final boss example like an evolution of the ideas behind 𝘕𝘴𝘴𝘕, an unstoppable force of a monster looking entirely unnatural as his design. Instead of just being big and imposing, having high health and high damage, it is reflected through his fight, through him being able to use 4 different elements and the destructive power that he has with all of them as well. Fantastic final bosses both for Village and online in Monster Hunter Tri. Then we have Portable Third, the port for 3rd generation, which did not have underwater combat. And so a lot of things were changed and new monsters were added, of course, as they liked doing with these portable ports, and they included the Village final boss here, 𝘕𝘂𝘸, who is also the flagship of Portable Third. This is a very similar situation to 𝘔𝘂𝑥 in Monster Hunter Freedom 2, a monster with a lot of love and care in
𝘕𝘂𝘸𝑥 is so cool.
but clearly only a final boss because of a technicality of quest order and progression decisions, more so than because they wanted it to feel specifically like a final boss of the game. For the online final boss of this game, however, this was when they introduced Amatsu, who I think is simply one of the best older generation spectacle monsters. The pure aura emanating from a creature that flies by swimming through the wind, the storms it produces with crazy tornadoes, it's...
I think that Monster Hunter needs to reclass a counter into Canlaws as Flanked Wyvern. The Flying Wyrens because Flying Wyrens didn't exist. Yeah. Aren't Fanged Wyverns like a 5th gen thing? I'm pretty sure. But they only had Flying Wyverns back then. But it still doesn't make sense. In that case, it could have just called them Elder Dragons or whatever. But yeah, they should reclassify them as Fanged Wyverns.
General attacks and just the design of it looking like some sort of divine beast sent down from the sky. A perfect example of final boss energy in my opinion. After that was the expansion of 3rd gen Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate. The Village final boss for this game was Ivory 𝘰𝘴𝘴𝑥, which I don't think is necessarily like a...
Yeah, I just think it's 5th gen because 5th gen had a lot of new Fanged Wyverns. That's why I'm kind of thinking it's 5th gen.
Bad final boss, specifically because he is the subspecies of the flagship of the original game of the generation, so there's some sort of build up to it through the progression of the games, but I don't think it has the same sort of impact as something like 𝘕𝘂𝘴𝘕 either, in my opinion, especially being the landlocked version of something that is most notable for being the flagship of underwater combat as a concept. The final boss of online quests in this game, however, was 𝘕𝑪𝑚ORALES, the final black dragon that we've seen so far.
We know about
really
him.
Turned up the dial on the concept of a spectacle fight, being an impossibly large monster said to have literally wiped out at least a portion of the population of the Tainted Sea by his mere presence there and the heat that emanated from his body. The fact that his shape resembled a 𝘕𝘴𝑴𝑙𝑒 as well, but on a gargantuan scale, really made him even more terrifying for anyone who had experienced the 𝘕𝘴𝑴𝑙𝑒s in previous games before, and I think that this fight is an incredibly cool first experience, but the actual fightability of the monster and the replayability of the quest is a little bit lacking, as it just isn't that interesting of a fight to engage with, and that's similar to 𝘕𝘂𝘴𝑥, who I talked about before as well, because this was when Capcom started to really nail the idea of the spectacle of final boss monsters, making them something that you would remember fighting forever, even if you only
I'm just assuming it's because underwater combat is kind of mid.
These were incredible things to experience because of that, but as we continue into the future, you will start to see the final bosses evolve into something even greater than that. 4th generation then, starting with Monster Hunter 4, the final boss of the Village questline was 𝘔𝘂𝘓, and this is the epitome of story relevance, making something feel like a final boss regardless of any other part. The entire story of the game revolves around the frenzy and 𝘔𝘰𝘓 and eventually 𝘔𝘂𝘓 at the end of it in a way that is a very reasonable evolution of something like 𝘔𝑥 or 𝘕𝘂𝘸 being a flagship monster that is also a final boss, but this is the adult variation of the flagship monster, and instead of being just a high quality, more standard monster design, he is a high quality Elder Dragon design specifically, and while it may not have the spectacle of some of the bigger final bosses, I think it still nails that final boss energy in a totally different kind of way. For the online final boss, we had the exact reverse of this, which was 𝘠𝘠𝑚𝑒𝑡𝑒𝑟. I have always loved the design of this guy, impossibly large snake with wicked spikes along him that bores through mountains, making his own paths by tunneling through wherever he wants to be. This is a perfect example of an incredibly potent spectacle within the fight itself, something just
the arms are just kind of goofy,
inspiring to see in front of you. But like the larger spectacle final bosses of 3rd generations, he was almost all spectacle, and not the most enjoyable to fight in itself, specifically replaying it multiple times, of course. The The first fight, fantastic experience. Fighting it beyond that, though, it just doesn't feel like the same gameplay as the rest of a Monster Hunter game. Fantastic final boss, but definitely a remnant of its era, and something that I think could be done so much better if they chose to bring it back in the modern Monster Hunter gameplay style. Then we had Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate, which is where things got slightly murkier. Specifically, the technical final boss of Village Quest is Rusted Kushala Daora, who after beating it, you have the credits roll for the game, which is the easiest simple way to tell something is what Capcom wanted you to think of as a final boss. Story-wise, Rusted Kushala Daora is great as it sort of caps off the storyline of the Ace Hunters perfectly, but fight-wise, it's not a massive variation from regular Kushala Daora as a monster, so it's great for story reasons, but not a whole lot of actual final boss energy from the creature itself, in my opinion, or the fight.
That's fair.
There's also a portion of the community that views Apex Seregios as the actual final boss of the village story in this game, as it is the introduction of the Apex system and unlocking the endgame of the game essentially, but this is a bit of an abnormality, and it being the first Apex monster does give it a bit of extra gravitas, but being just one member of a larger system, I wouldn't say it's the best example of a final boss either. The online quest final boss
being from a country new canals for second gen of the Monster Hunter Freedom Unite. Friends were in the thing yet. Usually reduce with 𝘕𝘪𝘯𝘵 and Stygian. Oh, yeah, I forgot about 𝘕𝘪𝘯𝘵. But 𝘕𝘪𝘯𝘵 was the only one for a while, right?
of 4 Ultimate, however, was 𝘔𝘰𝘯𝘵, incredibly large, incredibly threatening creature. The mechanics of it having a Dragonator in his back that you can break off and then use against him, and I think he was a great example of something that was an incredible, unforgettable spectacle, even in one singular fight, but also enjoyable enough as a monster in itself, and close enough to just fighting a monster normally in the game, but with some siege weapon mechanics on top of it, that it became a much more enjoyable experience as a hunt beyond just the spectacle itself. But we'll be talking about 𝘔𝘰𝘯𝘵 again a little bit later on too. In Monster Hunter Generations, the final boss of the village questline was 𝘔𝘂𝘶. This was much closer to Tigrex and 𝘕𝘠𝘠 being a flagship of that game that just sort of was thrust into the final boss position because of the technicality of quest progression order. And there wasn't even like a proper story building up to 𝘔𝘂𝘶 for this one either. You just have credits roll after fighting him, which makes him a final boss in an inarguable way. The final boss of the online hunt, however, was 𝘕𝑁𝑒𝑟𝑘os. And this is one that I think is very, very special in the way that they did it, because the way that they showed this monster was by having your first fight against him, his low rank fight, be just a shadow of the full creature, only fighting his tentacles while the actual proper body of the creature stays buried under the bones. And it's honestly quite confusing what the creature even is at that point. And only in his higher rank quest did you get to see the proper full monster revealed, the proper full fight, and it was a really fun way to sort of show this to the players as someone who experienced this in a pretty natural way without being spoiled about it beforehand. The fight was super memorable as well, really good spectacle moveset, including a giant laser beam, and using the low rank quest as a setup for the reveal in high rank is a great idea that was executed very well. For Generations Ultimate, the final boss of the village quest is Valstrax. He fits the bill as something quite abnormal looking with a very unique moveset based mostly around just blinding speed and an incredible spectacle for his super attack if nothing else. And while I would say that he doesn't quite have that final boss feeling, he does serve very well compared to the majority of village quest final bosses that have happened before this point in the series. The online final boss of this game was unquestionably 𝘕𝘂𝘠. This was an example of a final boss that has that incredible spectacle aspect to it, the insanity of the creature
so badly,
beams and eventually even Dragonators and water wheels, and then using those pieces to construct a full-on mech that you have to disable. It's just a ridiculously over-the-top fight in all of the best ways that completely matches the energy of Generations Ultimate, and yet outside of the mech phase specifically, it does just sort of feel like an exaggerated version of fighting a standard monster. 𝘕𝘂𝘠 as a beast was very fightable, and so it sort of nailed that final boss energy.
I so hope we get 𝘕𝘂𝘠 in Wilds expansion.
Some previous spectacle-heavy monsters
so hard.
Then we get to the 5th generation, and that's where things start to get a little bit more clear cut, at least for a little bit, because the final boss was simply the monster at the end of the story. In base Monster Hunter World, this was Xeno'jiiva, an unbelievable spectacle directly at the heart of the story of the game, and while it feels much more like fighting an actual monster than some of the spectacle final bosses we've been over, it still is much more bark than bite, much more about that first fight experience, and not something that most people would go out of their way to hunt a bunch of times just for fun. But it was still on the upswing of final bosses. It had undeniable undeniable final boss aura and energy, clearly designed purposefully as a final boss by the developers, and the fight was very enjoyable, memorable, and special. You could also make an argument from this point forwards that the equivalent of an online final boss is a final new monster added to these games in 5th generation forwards through the title update system. But I don't think that we want to apply that logic to World specifically quite yet, as that would make the final boss technically be Lepsin from the Witcher crossover, which definitely doesn't feel quite right. Moving to Iceborne, the final boss of the story itself was 𝘕𝘂𝘓, and this one I think is a legendary monster. The story involvement is super high, of course, all leading up to this monster. The spectacle and intimidation factor is intense even from the very beginning of the quest, but then the way that it continues through the fight, the shedding of the mantle of rock, and when you bust it off, the reveal,
I just have no comment except, hey, look, this monster is kind of cool.
And then eventually it opens up to completely unnatural eyes and stares directly into your soul. Its moveset has a bunch of wildly creative beam options. It turns the ground into quicksand and can even sink into it, and it even has a full-on spirit bomb attack. By my own personal opinions, I think in concept, in design, in the way that it plays out as a fight, this is one of the greatest spectacles in the history of the series, even compared to the games that have released since Iceborne. This fight, the first time, I cannot possibly express the feeling of going through it that I had.
I can't wait to play Iceborne.
Because it exists on the internet forever.
That's fucking awesome, whatever the fuck it is.
Wait, what am I looking at? Like,
yeah,
dude,
holy shit,
dude, what air blast lines at me? He's firing. What is that? What is that?
He's the Death Star.
Firing a what the fuck?
Spirit bomb, dude. He's like a giant tree.
𝘕𝘂𝘓 was more replayable than Xeno'jiiva in my opinion, as I just felt like its moveset was more satisfying to fight against despite also being incredibly large, and while it wasn't quite on the level of fightable as something like 𝘕𝘂𝘓 or Amatsu in the 3rd gen, it is still my personal favorite final boss experience within the entire series. Then a fun bonus note, the final title update for Iceborne was of course the return of Fatalis, and you could easily make an argument that this makes him count as a final boss in Iceborne as well, and his Iceborne version turns up the spectacle factor to 11 compared to his original fight. It adds a ton of interesting complexities like his super attack and having to hide from it with your actual position in the arena, or the fact that breaking his horns could weaken his fire attacks later in the fight, and it just made him feel like such a perfect example of a final boss, especially when combined with his intimidating design and the history of Fatalis lore. And this was, I think, when the Monster Hunter team essentially got to flex and say, hey, you know the final boss of our first game in the series? This is what that would look like if Monster Hunter 1 had been made today. And holy hell was it an incredible showing, and also a very satisfying fight to actually engage with, while at the same time being one of the most brutally challenging fights the mainline series has ever had. After that, we moved to Monster Hunter Rise, which out of nowhere went back to having village storylines separate from the online quests, confusing the final bossness of it all a bit more. Final boss of village story quests was Magna Malo, flagship of the game, relevant to the story, but this was in that line of final bosses that just happens to be won by technicality of quest progression and story rather than it feeling like it was designed to be a final boss by the devs. Solid monster for sure, but it doesn't feel like a final boss. That said, the final boss of the online story didn't actually happen until the final title update of the base game, because that's when the story actually concluded, and most people theorized that this was due to the timing of the game coming out in early 2021, and so the development cycle was heavily impacted by the big disease that I'm not allowed to say the name of lest YouTube strike me down. And so this is an example of the final title update monster also being the clear ending of the story properly itself, and so it's undeniably the online final boss of Rise, Allmother 𝘰𝘴𝘓, the version of 𝘰𝘴𝘓 that takes in the essence of Ibushi to be an unbelievable spectacle fight after the fact, and a very fightable monster as well, with it essentially sort of having phases on and off of switching between feeling like a regular monster that is a little bit big, and then more like a siege fight properly at different points too. But even just for the fact that you can watch 𝘰𝘴𝘓 consume Ibushi's essence in the quest itself is such an incredible example of the final boss energy radiating from this fight. Then we move on to the Sunbreak expansion. Final boss of the story was 𝘕𝘂𝘓, and it was of course extremely story relevant as like the walking home of the 𝘰𝘰𝘯𝘵, unleashing them upon the lands and causing all of the main issues that happened in the story. The fight itself was very big as a spectacle as well, and the monster looked super unnatural, but to the point that to me it was almost too unnatural. Like it fit the spectacle of making it feel like an insurmountable threat, but it almost felt more alien than terrestrial to me personally. That said, I would say that this was a bit less spectacle than 𝘰𝘴𝘓 was, and a bit less replay value than 𝘰𝘴𝘓 as well, but still an incredible example of a final boss monster in the series, especially with the phase where you have to shoot him down off of the wall as he tries to climb up and escape, and more than anything else, just the pure constant pressure of what would happen if this monster made it up to the surface and escaped. It created just a perfect atmosphere for the backdrop of this fight. The final title update of Sunbreak was the release of 𝘰𝘴𝘦 𝘊𝘰𝘥𝘦, who was an evolved version of the flagship monster, sort of similar to the way that I view 𝘔𝘰𝘯𝘵𝘩 in comparison to 𝘔𝘰𝘯𝘵 in Monster Hunter 4, except that 𝘰𝘴𝘦 𝘊𝘰𝘥𝘦's visuals were a whole spectacle in itself too, and beyond that, the fight was absolutely incredible, super in-depth, very unique, and along with having one of the most satisfying yet challenging fights in the game. It just feels like a perfect sort of ending to the story, as well as it sort of caps off the existence of 𝘊𝘰𝘠 being a protector rather than a threat, with this version of him that has both the angelic and demonic sides to it, fully caused by the Curios themselves, and so I absolutely view him as a final boss as well. Then we move on to the current Monster Hunter game, Monster Hunter Wilds, and what counts as a final boss.
Also, one with
Right
Elder
now.
Dragon,
Once again,
just
we do
from
away
design
with village
alone.
and online quest splits, and credits roll after the end of the low-rank story in this game, which clearly points to 𝘕𝘪𝘯 being the official final boss of Monster Hunter Wilds.
𝘕𝘪𝘯 is such a
construct
good
that is
final
essentially
boss.
built to use attacks from black dragons, and being a perfect ending of the whole storyline of the constructs and guardians in general, and Wyveria and the Dragon Torch. It all just gives him a massive story impact as well. Mechanically speaking, the way that you had to peel off its regenerating shell of armor to get to the meat of the monster underneath, and the way that it interacted with Wilk as a mechanic with some of the more ridiculous attacks it has, like the massive fire breath. It just made for a creature that felt like some sort of unholy mix of multiple previous final bosses in the series, which is a perfect way to cap off the story that is Monster Hunter Wilds. And I think that this is a fantastic showing of exactly how the concept of final bosses has slowly changed from that first Fatalis in the first game, being mostly a being based on bravado and raw stats, slowly turning into something like 𝘕𝘪𝘯 with massively spectacular visuals in its actual moveset, a deep and intriguing moveset beyond that, meaningful mechanics, and huge story impact. This is how Monster Hunter's final bosses have evolved over the years. That said, there are still two more monsters I want to talk about with Wilds, but I would say that 𝘕𝘪𝘯 is by far the most legitimate final boss for Wilds. The other two are more technicalities. Arkveld is the final boss of the high-rank story, which you could call the post-story, but he's the final new monster before the endgame properly opens up, which makes him pretty clear to say that he acts as the final boss of base high rank. Story-wise, incredible impact. Design-wise, incredible monster. And the fight is one that I consider super satisfying too, but it doesn't have the same spectacle factor as something like 𝘕𝘪𝘯, which is sort of in line with the fact that it is just one of multiple monsters. It is a flagship that ended up with a final boss position by technicality. Then we should finally discuss 𝘔𝘰𝘯𝘕 as the monster that is attached to the final title update for the game. And while the story relevance is minimal,
𝘔𝘰 is
the
very
connection to
much like a
Thaddeus
final
and Gemma
boss.
and now Nadia as our friends from the 4th generation game gave him some extra context and importance within Wilds 2, as that's where he was originally from. We talked about his original version, but to really express the gap from a final boss in 4th generation to Wilds, the 𝘔𝘰𝘯𝘕 fight is such a great example to look at. In 4th gen, he was a spectacle that felt mostly fightable. In Wilds, the spectacle level is way higher than the original fight, but so is the fight ability. The telegraphs, the attack patterns, they're readable and interesting and fun. The phases make sense, and each of them have a distinct combat feel, and the extra oomph of the 4 support hunters really just adding a lot of weight to the quest. The taking the classic Dragonator from his back and replacing it with a freaking laser cannon on his back that you can fire at him for a ridiculously cool moment, and then the big super attacks and damage checks in the final phase just all come together to give him just this incredibly large feeling of being a final boss. And while I think the original 𝘔𝘰𝘯𝘕 was a great final boss, GOG in Wilds is a big example of how much the concept of a final boss has grown even in that small of a gap from the 4th gen to the 6th gen. That pretty much does it for today then, everyone. A look back through the Monster Hunter series with a specific focus on the monsters typically considered final bosses of each game. I do think that if we were just going off of what actually feels like a final boss properly, this list would of course be much smaller, but it's important to go through all of them and why they are counted as final bosses if you want to truly understand this series as a whole. I hope you've all enjoyed this then, and let me know your own thoughts on the final bosses of Monster Hunter through the years in the comments down below. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.
Limited life is from frontier. Yeah. It's a good way. I get that flagships being the in quotation marks final boss is kind of underwhelming, but I think it makes sense since they're usually the monster that has, you know, narrative importance. So that makes sense to me.